Boom! Welcome back to the 21 Convention 2022 of Orlando, Florida, being held for the 16-year anniversary at 21 Summit. Our next speaker is a returning speaker to the 21 Convention, first speaking way back in 2019, a couple years ago. Time goes fast, huh? He also spoke in 2020 and at other events as well, like for women at the 22 Convention. He is the world's most controversial dating coach. He's the world's most wanted dating coach. You'll be hearing about that at some point. And he's the world's leading expert on hypergamy. #1 by far champion hypergamy. You want to know about hypergamy? You Google hypergamy, you find Pat Stedman all day long. Now, without further ado, please let me welcome back to the 21 Convention stage, Pat Stedman. Welcome back.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate it.
Yeah, man.
Hello, gentlemen. My name is Pat Stedman, and as Anthony said, I'm a dating and relationship coach for men. I've been doing this since 2015, and over that time period, I've worked with hundreds of men on the full life cycle of their relationships with women, going all the way from approaching, attracting, keeping, and then once guys are in relationships, dealing with issues like high conflict, dead bedroom, etc. I like the variety of this. Some guys like to specialize, but for me, it's really interesting to solve all these distinct problems. It's fun to be on the call with one guy who's a virgin and has pretty much never dated a woman in his life, and then to be on the phone with another guy who's been married for 10 years and him and his wife are just kind of out of sync and having all this conflict, and then another guy who is maybe very good at getting women, sleeps with women pretty easily, but feels empty and unfulfilled and doesn't know how to get a woman who's going to make him feel special, make him feel a little bit warm and fuzzy inside, let's put it that way. But while all these guys have different surface issues, when you get back down to it at the core level, there's emotional issues that are causing all of these surface problems. So the question is, what is going on here exactly? What are these emotional issues doing? What are they impacting? And when you get right down to it, what they're impacting for every single guy is their frame and ultimately their state of consciousness. We're going to get into consciousness in a bit. But let's first talk about frame. Frame is one of those topics that's really popular to discuss in the Manosphere. Everyone's like, you got to hold frame, bro. You know, it's just, it's a meme almost. But what is frame exactly? Well, frame is a set of assumptions that are agreed upon by people. Okay, it's a mouthful. We're going to go into it. And is this big enough, guys, in the back? Because I've been told that sometimes it's hard to see. You guys see that okay? Somebody? Yeah, thank you. So it's a set of agreed upon assumptions. So when you and a woman are on a date and she doesn't know yet whether or not she's attracted to you, there's going to be this challenge of your frame, and we're going to get into shit test in a moment because that's how women will tend to challenge your frame. But you have these two different perceptions of reality. So when you're trying to make a woman attracted to you, when you want her to be attracted to you, the key point to making that happen is to have her come into your frame. And so long as that hasn't occurred, the woman is not sort of fully invested in you. And frame is used all over, well beyond even just the dating space. The media, for instance, its primary purpose is to frame. So what the media will do is it will control the conversation, because if you control the conversation, you control the bounds in which people can think. And if you control the bounds in which people can think, you control people. And so one of the reasons that governments have focused much more on what we will call psychological operations over the years is because it's much easier to control a population if you can get them to simply agree with you rather than having to use physical force. If you can convince somebody who's maybe got a lot more power, like the population at large has a lot more implicit power based on numbers, if you can convince them through control of the frame to maybe feel disempowered, then you're able to control the conversation. So you can see how frame is really everything. This is why they say that proverbially the pen is mightier than the sword. So when this comes to men in their interactions with women, it's obviously important because the same thing applies. And one of the main ways that you're going to see the Manosphere will talk about how to control the frame is going to be very tactical, it's very technical. And it has to deal mostly with shit tests. Shit tests are really frame tests. And while this isn't going to be like an encyclopedic exploration of shit tests, because there's a lot of different ones, and there's a lot of different responses to shit tests you can do. Just for basic housekeeping, there's shit tests that are more about whether or not you're an attractive guy, so we'll call that desire, and then there's shit tests that are about whether or not you care about her, which are more comfort. We're not going to go into the details of that, but suffice to say, you have shit tests, and we're going to explore 3 primary ways that maybe you'll respond to a shit test. So let's give like a very simple example here. You cold approach a girl in a mall, and she says to you, how many other women do you approach like this? So the first way that maybe you'll respond to this, well, first we'll give the example of a guy who would respond poorly. So the sort of standard guy who's not initiated into this stuff will answer her directly. And what he'll say is something like, oh no, I don't usually do this, I just really thought you were cute and I wanted to talk to you. And that would be considered on a tactical level at least failing the shit test, because what the guy's done is he's acknowledged her framing of him as doing something that maybe he shouldn't be doing. And so when that's occurred, now that may not be the end of the interaction for the guy, because the guy may say that with a very genuine authenticity. It might not blow him out of the water, but the woman's gonna be then like sniffing around, and the guy can expect more shit tests, and certainly if he keeps failing this, she's eventually gonna lose interest because he's accepted her frame of the interaction, and therefore he's no longer leading. He was qualifying himself to her. So one of the most classic ways that you would respond to this instead is with an assumption. So amplification. So amplification, and there's 2 ways you can amplify. You can either agree and amplify, or you can disagree and amplify. And so an example of that would be, so she says, how many other women have you approached like this? And you can say, oh, you're number 50 today. And so it's like you make it kind of like an absurd number, and you're not showing any shame around it, and so that throws her off, right? You're basically saying that her challenge to your frame is silly, so I'm going to respond in a silly way. You could also do disagree and amplify, and you could say, actually, you're the first woman who I've talked to besides for my mother. And that'll also throw her off because it's another absurd statement. That can work really well. Another way that you can do it is you can deflect. And deflect is basically you are going to ignore what she's saying to you. So she asks you, how many other women have you approached like this today? And you say, the thing about you, the reason I wanted to go and talk to you is like, I noticed that you were carrying these 2 big bags of shoes, and I was wondering, are you a shoe hoarder? Like, are you one of those girls that's got like closets full of shoes in there? Like, whatever. The point is that you just ignore her statement, and you continue, you make more assumptions about her, you continue with your approach gambit. And very often this works. And the reason it works is because what you're basically saying is that her frame challenge is not relevant, it's not worth even responding to, it's not worth legitimizing. And this will work well with most women and with most shit tests because they jump onto the next shiny object, right? They don't necessarily come back to that, they're not fixated on it. But some women are. And so if a woman is going to really push on this shit test and she's like, no, really, how many other women do you approach? Then you might move to number 3, which is reversal. And reversal is probably the most powerful of the 3, although most guys don't necessarily use it immediately. So if she says, how many other women do you approach like this? You would respond and say, are you one of those women who's always comparing herself to other girls? And so what you do is you make her go a little bit on the defensive, that she's associating herself, that she has to be like, no, I'm not thinking about other women, so she's now qualifying herself to you. And in certain situations, that can actually be really, really powerful, especially if she's been testing you a good amount. And so the key thing here is that you don't want to be qualifying yourself to her. And so this is one of the things that guys, when they first start off in game, is they make a lot of mistakes about, because they're out trying to impress girls and be attractive. And while it's very important to understand what is and isn't attractive, at the end of the day, if you're just focused on being attractive to a woman, then you are completely in her frame. You're like a dancing monkey, you're a clown, because you're constantly trying to show her, hey, look at me, I'm attractive, look at me, I'm attractive. And after 15 minutes or so, 30 minutes certainly, she's not going to be interested anymore. When you start to qualify her and look at her and say, try to figure her out, is she good enough for you? That attitude, that mindset is much more effective. So a lot of conversations around frame in the manosphere revolve around this area, which is a very tactical area. But there's a catch here, and the reality is that when we go to that initial example of the guy who didn't do the shit test correctly, didn't pass it correctly, and when he said to her in response to how many other women do you approach like this, and he says, I don't usually do this, but you were really beautiful and I really wanted to approach you. Based on how that guy is anchored into that truth, it may actually be very attractive to the woman. So it's not maybe technically, tactically correct, but it doesn't mean that he's conceded the frame, because his intention in that statement is not to get her to view him in a certain way. It's not to qualify himself to her. He's just being really honest and really genuine. And then you have other guys. So that guy may be very successful with the woman. It may actually have a really good relationship. It might be very romantic to her. Whereas another guy, you could have PUAs who are out there, maybe sleep with thousands of girls, absolute masters at all this wordplay, knowing how to pass shit tests. But one of the things with these guys is that, and I'm not generalizing all of them, because guys have different reasons for being single, but for a good number of these guys, a proportion of these guys, one of the reasons that they stay in that sort of single zone is because they actually don't want to get found out. They have a good tactical mastery of game. They have a good tactical mastery of shit tests. But when it comes to their core frame, they can appear on the surface like there may be some alpha guy, and they keep her at arm's length, so the woman who's like trying to investigate, is this guy really alpha? He's like, he won't let her get that close to him. So she's always, which is good for the seduction process, she's trying to get closer, figure it out. But if she ever were to get closer to him, she'd find out, wait, this guy's really insecure. This guy's really anxious. And she'd start to pick him apart. And which is why it is a truism that if you want to have a healthy relationship, a relationship that has a lot of passion and intimacy, you need to have 10 times the frame of your average single guy who's decent at getting women. Because women can sniff out all these weaknesses. And if you've got them and you're trying to hide them, you're not going to be able to do that in a relationship. So, we can see here that frame actually has more of a strategic component to it. And while the tactics are important to understand and learn, there is this macro element of, well, what makes a guy actually have strong frame? And for that, we're going to take a look at the concept of consciousness. So, consciousness is a little bit of a woo-woo thing. I had a crystal I was going to wear on here, but it interfered with the mic, so I can't look like a hippie. But consciousness is this idea of basically where your general perception is, how you interact with reality. And we have these terms higher consciousness and lower consciousness, which kind of give us a bit of a understanding of discrepancies. So as an example, let's say you and your coworker were both trying to get a promotion, both vying for the same promotion, and your coworker got it. So if you were like a lower conscious individual, you'd be like, fuck that guy, I gotta find a way to screw him up, I'm gonna destroy his career. And so maybe you spread rumors about him, maybe you're nasty, you try to build alliances to take him down. It's very much based on vices like greed, control. There's a very serious sense of lack with low consciousness people, and they tend to always be trying to tear other people down, basically. And then you have a high consciousness person would be like, hey, I'm really happy for you, like really magnanimous, maybe would get them something, throw a party for them even. You don't have to go that far, but the point is that they would be okay with the situation. They'd be happy for the other person's success rather than feeling like it somehow diminished them. So consciousness as this concept, I think, was really brought about by Dr. David Hawkins, and it's down here at the bottom you can see. He was the first person who described it in his book, Power versus Force. It's a very good book. I recommend you read it. It's not a complicated read. It'll give you a better understanding of all this stuff. Another author who is worth exploring is Frederick Dodson, who I think goes a little bit more into detail about the subtleties of these different levels. But the point here is that you have consciousness, and you have these different levels, and you have different numbers assigned to them. I'm not going to get into how these numbers were derived, how they were measured. But the basic point here is that the higher consciousness you are, the stronger your vibe is, the more energy you put out there. So maybe you've heard various people in the game world. There's always been like a bit of a disagreement between people who are very, very much on the tactical, technical side, and then guys who are very much like, it's about your vibe. And they're both right depending on where you look on the scale, but vibe is very important because the vibe you give off impacts, like if you're at a higher level of consciousness, your vibe is going to be more attractive to more women because you're gonna have more energy to you. Guys who have more energy are more noticed by other people. So, and it's a logarithmic thing. So when we see the difference between, apathy at 50 and anger at 150, we say, oh, anger's 3 times as more powerful. It's not, it's a lot more powerful. It's logarithmic. It's 10 to the 50th power versus 10 to the 150th power. So it's a very, very profound difference in the energy and vibe you give off. So when we look at shame, which is the very bottom, shame is the closest thing to death. When you are ashamed, you basically believe like you are a problem. Your existence is a problem. And so people who have deep, deep sense of shame tend to not do things to even sustain their life. They might not eat. Historically, if you were ostracized from your tribe and you had to leave, you were shamed out of your tribe, it was considered a death sentence. It's not a coincidence. It's literally right above death. A lot of people who are on the streets are down at this level. And by the way, when we talk about being at a level, it's not that if you're at 200 that you don't experience emotions down here. It's just that this is maybe your aggregate number. You move up in some ways, you're down in others, but this is sort of your base state. Okay, so it's important to understand that because it's relevant to how you raise your consciousness. So with women, if you have tons of shame, then you're not even going to try to improve because you're like, no woman's ever going to want me. These are guys who maybe drop a comment in the comment section, but are mostly not saying anything. They're not even engaging in the dating world because they hate themselves so much. Then you have guilt, which is right above shame, also super destructive. This is the sense of really deeply internalized like sinfulness, like I'm a terrible person, I do terrible things all the time. My ex left me because I'm bad. It's very self-critical. And so these guys tend to blame themselves for things and not women, right? They feel like they've messed up their lives and they have to constantly atone for messing up, making mistakes. Then you get the apathy. And apathy is actually how do I put this? Apathy is an improvement because but it's still obviously fairly low consciousness. You don't feel like it's really worth doing anything. It's kind of like some really hardcore black pill guys, hardcore MGTOWs might be in that direction where they're like, what's even the point of dealing with women? All women are like that. Women suck. Like, you're never going to be able to be successful with them, so why even bother? So it's kind of this cynical position. And then you get to grief. And grief is a big jump forward because when you get to grief, now you're like, I just really wish I could have someone. I really wish that I was able to get someone. And then there's like processing that occurs. You're starting to deal with some of the emotions, and that can springboard you to the next level, which is fear, which is, well, am I not going to be able to, like, what do I have to do to get someone? Like, fear is like where action starts to occur, but it's like gun to the back of the head action. Like, a lot of marketing campaigns are based around fear. Like, you're a beta bitch if you don't buy my course. You know, you're never going to get laid unless you work with me immediately. You know, it's like this kind of stuff. And for a guy who's, here, that's like they're going to laugh at that. But for a guy who's down here at fear, they're going to buy because it's going to trigger all their anxiety, and they're going to feel like I have to do something. So these are guys who will decide to go out there and do things with women, but it's like they have to have someone push them into it. They maybe will go out to the bar to meet girls, but they won't talk to any girl. They'll just stay there at the bar and they'll freeze. That's some of the fear coming in there. And then you get to desire. And this is where guys are more driven by what we would call like lust or greed. Like they want to sleep with women, but they have a lot of need for the validation of that. So they'll go and talk to women, but they're usually not super effective. They send like kind of distorted energy. Maybe it comes across as creepy. Nice guys tend to do this stuff, and essentially it's mixed responses. And these guys will tend to get angry. And anger is a great thing. Anger gets a really big rap in society. But out of everything down here, anger is the big springboard. Can be, at least. Because when you get angry, that's when a guy starts to say, why does this woman have so much power over me? What makes her better than me? And that can become an outburst that then leads to rejection, that then maybe leads him to drop down again, or it can lead him to start changing his behavior and say, you know what, I'm going to go talk to more girls, I don't care, and I'm going to interact with them differently. I don't care about their approval anymore. And then you start to get to pride. And pride is where a lot of red pill gurus end up, in pride. Because they are now able to get women who are in these lower levels, fear, desire, etc. And they have control. Pride is I deserve this stuff, you should be giving this stuff to me. And it becomes this sort of, it's like the whole thing is a power dynamic, it's a war, but when you're at pride, you're on top. And so these guys feel pretty good about themselves, but they might not put themselves in situations where that ego could be challenged. There's that famous expression, pride goes before the fall, because pride is a very brittle confidence, because it's fundamentally based on the other person being beneath you. Everything down here, all of these, are fundamentally parasitic energies. Doesn't mean that if you're there, we all have pockets of this stuff. None of us are saints in this room. So I'm not saying that to shame you, but these are all energies that are fundamentally based on lack and are based on, I have it, they lose it. I only get it if they lose it. Once you get to courage, you start to have positive energy where you start to radiate energy and give more than you're taking. And so courage is when you say, well, you know what? I'm afraid, but I'm going to go out there anyway. I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to put myself out there. I'm going to have, maybe I'll compete against some other people, but it's all good. If I fail, it's okay. Like, I'll just get back up there. And then you get the neutrality, which is that, well, if she didn't want to be with me, that's okay. There's other girls out there. It's more accepting. You're not even necessarily focused on competing against other people. And then you get to willingness, and this is very honest, self-honest, where something happens and you're like, well, what did I do to cause that? How can I learn? How can I grow? This is where you get into like really positive self-improvement. Everything up here is it's expanding to the world. When you're in one of these levels of consciousness, you're making the world a better place. Acceptance. Now, you're just focused on mastery. What a woman does or doesn't do is not really of concern to you because you're now internally motivated. You're looking at yourself and how you can grow. You're not looking at what women can do with this. And then you have reason. And now you're just interested in learning. So when something bad happens, you're trying to understand what's going on and put things together. There's way less personalization. And then you get to these very, very high levels up here. And love gets a bad rap in the manosphere, that's for sure. But when you get to this point, if a woman were to do something, you wouldn't be affected by it at all. Like up here, you might say, like, I understand why she's doing this. Like, I'm not gonna take it personally. Like, this is, like, you might explain it. Yeah, well, women do this because when a woman's insecure, this is how she, presents herself. But when you're up here, you'll look at it and you'll be like, she's such a beautiful person. Okay, yeah, she's insecure about this, but it's cute. It's a very powerful thing. I mean, it sounds beta because most guys are trying to mimic that down here. They don't actually feel it. They're just hoping, like, if I tolerate her bad behavior, maybe she'll, let me hit it. Whereas up here, it's like a real unconditional love and acceptance. And then you have up here, it's like literally everything is amazing and beautiful. And this shit doesn't matter for us because there's really nobody, not too many people like this. When you're up at peace, I mean, you are now like the dude who's sitting on in Tibet, like meditating. Because at this point, you're no longer even associating subject and object. You're like, well, we're all connected, we're all one, so, kind of difficult to be in a relationship with a person like that. And this is like Jesus or Buddha or something like that. So, from a population standpoint, this is the vast majority of the population. And then this is maybe, let's say, 20%, everything in here. And then 5% would be everything above, of which 4.5% is pretty much here at love. Like, you're just not going to meet people up there. So what is the implications of this stuff and about consciousness and how it affects you and your frame? So let's use an example. Car accident. You get into a car accident. What happens when you're down here? This is your base level of consciousness. Oh my God, I can't believe this happened to me. My life's over. I can barely afford that car. How am I going to get by? I can't do anything. It's just going to be mass panic. Up here, fuck that guy. I'm going to get his money. I'm going to sue him in court. I'm going to get what's mine because he took it from me. And then you get up here. Man, that was a really shitty day. It was a really shitty day. But you're just gonna have to go through it. Like, it is what it is. You get up here. What did I do to cause that? I should have been paying more attention. Next time, I'm gonna learn from that. I'm not gonna let that happen again. And then you get up to here. It's like, wow, it was so exciting. You see what happened to me? I got into a car accident. It's like crazy, right? Oh well, everyone's safe. Haha, it's all good. No problems. And so The point here, though, is that notice the distinction between up here where you're like, I hope that other person's okay, I'm glad nobody's hurt, everything's great, it's just money, who cares? Life is good, just another story. With down here, which is that my life is over. Some people are like this about little things because this is the only thing that they know. And so when we talk about having a strong frame, I think that the conversation gets a little bit too narrow. We talk about it down here, and we talk about it from a relative basis, a positionality. That I lost frame, they gain frame. And what this really is ultimately is it's kind of brittle. Whereas when you start to get in higher levels of consciousness, you're a lot stronger. And the reason you're stronger is because down here, it's like you can't take anything. Here it's like, well, I'm really tough, I can take a lot. But up here it's like, what am I even taking? And this is really powerful. You have to really understand this. That the reason that some people are so much more resilient than others is because they do not perceive their challenges as being challenges. You can only take a certain amount. Your system will get overloaded if you perceive yourself as being attacked. You're going to start drinking heavily. You're going to start doing things just to try to deal with all the stress. But if you can change your perception and comprehension of the stress in the situation altogether, then you're not going to be stressed. You might drop down briefly, but then you'll be able to anchor yourself and pull back up. It's natural to drop down at moments. I'm not saying that if you ever feel one of these emotions that you're somehow, this low consciousness individual. The point here is that this provides us an idea of a different way of living. And it's very, very relevant also with our game. Because if your frame is up here, then if a woman throws a shit test at you, it's just not going to rattle you. You're not going to be affected by it because you're not looking outside of yourself at what she's doing as being relevant. You're internally motivated. Why would anything that she's doing even affect you? And so your frame is so much more automatically stronger up here. And the game that you use to attract women correspondingly changes. So this is one of the things. And I get a lot of heat for it. But I think we've built our argument up to the point, which is that the red pill is correct. It's correct. Women are hypergamous. As Anthony noted, I'm the expert on hypergamy. Nobody can tell me about hypergamy. I get it, okay? But it's not all that women are. Women who are down here, that's their motivation. Women down here are motivated by power games. And so if you are going to date a woman who's down here, then you are going to have to play that game. And you're also going to have to understand it for women up here because they still have points that anchor them down at this level. But if you try to act like you would with a girl who's maybe down here at desire, where you're running some very, very aggressive dread game, that's going to work on a girl in desire. She's going to see those girls want him, I want him. And they're going to go right after you. It'll work. But a girl up here, it's not going to work very well. It might trigger some things in her, but then it might also be like, why is he treating me this way? It's going to start to, because she's starting to develop a sense of self, some self-esteem. And she's like, why should I allow myself to be disrespected like this? And so you have to also decide what kind of relationship you want to have. Because you can dominate in a relationship down here, but you're going to be constantly with these sort of power games. You're going to have to keep a hard fist at all times, because if you ever let up, if you ever show any weakness, then you're going to get some serious shit test. Maybe she's going to try to get back at you, go to some other guy. And you're just playing in this game. Whereas up here, there's much more of an authentic connection that can occur. Again, you have to understand this, because a woman may be mostly up here, but she has some pocket down here. You have to be able to deal with the spectrum of consciousness. But if you want to grow, if you want to have a different relationship, you do not have to have a zero-sum relationship. You don't have to have one. Because the more you're up here, you can deconstruct things down here, even with her. You can understand it, and you can tap into higher levels of connection. How do you move yourself up in levels of consciousness? If you look at this like this is your base layer right here, you're going to have some things that allow you to access up here maybe, but you'll have other ones down here. So maybe you have a porn addiction. So you're stuck at, there's this pocket that's very, very filled with lust. It's down at desire. That brings down your consciousness. And that anchors you further down the shame, because then you feel like a piece of shit because of your lust. And so in order to deal with this, you have to deal with the shame at the bottom. If you want to improve your frame, you have to improve your shame. You have to get rid of your shame. You have to eliminate it. Your shame is what keeps you down here, because it's the very bottom anchor. And so what that looks like in practice can be a little scary, because shame thrives in darkness. It's the stuff that you keep hidden that festers and builds as shame. So an example that a lot of guys have faced is that they try to, they go with a girl and they have a performance issue, can't get it up. And so sometimes they may just try to avoid the situation, but other times they're there and they'll really try to, they might say, oh, this doesn't usually happen. They'll try to cover their shame. And then what that does is it makes the woman feel shame, because women don't feel, if a guy can't get it up, the guy's always thinking about himself, like she's gonna think I'm a beta, she thinks I can't, perform. And it's possible she might think some of that, depending on where she's at here. But if she has shame about her own self-worth and self-image, and a lot of women do, then what happens is that then you trigger her shame, and shame shuts down her own desire to connect and have sex. It becomes this sort of thing where you're protecting yourself, and so then she goes and protects herself. And so it's a risk. It's a risk to be open. It's a risk to say, yeah, this happens sometimes, this is something I'm working through. It's a risk to say that, because she might be like, well, I don't want to be with you. And you have to deal with that. But if you're with a girl who maybe for the most part is up here, but she has some shame pockets, then what happens is that the two of you start to actually clear out what's down here, and you're able to move yourselves much, much more up here. Because that shame was festering on the fact that nobody could find out about it. But then you're authentic and you're open, and you're allowing yourself to be rejected, you're stepping into courage, and so you gradually become more self-accepting. And your relationship with everything changes, because then when other people down here try to interact with you in a certain way, they try to bring you down, you're not even going to play those games. And that's the one thing I want you guys to understand here, is you have a choice at what kind of game you want to play. There's a reason why there are so many fucking opinions about what girls like. It's because women at different levels of consciousness want different things. You need to decide for yourself what kind of games you want to play. There's a whole set of games and ways to operate that you have to engage in if you want to get girls down here. You cannot act like Mr. Love and Light with girls down here. They will be like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? No idea what he's talking about. They might feel a little bit weird, though, because you're not acting like a guy normally would. But they're probably going to feel too uncomfortable by the whole thing and go back to someone, you know. A lot of guys who are mostly up here, I work with a lot of these guys, by the way, who are mostly up here, but they have these shame pockets, will get them involved with a woman who's down here. And that woman screws them up. That woman betrays them. That woman hurts them. And they don't understand why she could do it. It's because they couldn't read at what level of consciousness that woman was at. They played a stupid game, and they won a stupid prize. You can do the same. It's your choice. There's no right answers here. But if you start to proceed in life through this mindset about consciousness, where are people at? Who am I dating? What kind of girls do I want to draw in? Everything in your life will change, and it will change for the better. Thank you very much. Now, I know this is a complicated topic, so I'm really happy to take some questions. If any of you guys want to grill me, just head up to the microphone.
Test. Fantastic speech. Very informative. So I look at that chart there, that power force chart, and I see myself all over it in different aspects, right? I'm very antagonistic. I do have some bouts of despair and hopelessness, but at the same time, I also see myself ratcheting it up when the occasion calls for it to be very courageous, etc. So how do you kind of rectify, hey, there's one part of me that is very clearly above the line, and then another part that is very clearly below the line. You almost have like a schizophrenic, like, why do I react so differently depending on the context? So I guess the question is, how do you reconcile those pockets of shame, as you say? How do you go ahead and bridge the gap to be more of a homogenous level than all over the board?
Great question. So when we have trauma, various things in our backstory, it creates pockets down here and then we'll have certain triggers that'll bring us down here. Because that's how, in a certain situation, maybe that's how we responded to it. We might be mostly up here, but these pockets pull us down. And so in order to actually stabilize your field, so to speak, you need to deal with the pockets. That's where a lot of the deep work comes from. I do think people also choose at a certain point. I mean, when you're trying when you're overcoming something down here, there's a level of resistance at first to it that really forces you to deal with it. You get triggered over and over and over again because it doesn't want to let go. So you really have to okay, why am I getting angry? Why am I ashamed of this thing? Why is this, what is happening here? And that's why when you get to, let's say, willingness, which is it becomes more self-correcting because that's when people start to really decide, okay, yeah, I'm gonna do more inner work, I'm gonna clear this stuff out. And gradually, you do move forward. I mean, one of the things I'll say is that I found relationships to be really profoundly impactful with that because when you're close to somebody, you can't hide from yourself because they have to deal with that dark side of you and they throw it in your face. And so you end up having to make decisions about whether to deal with these problems, which you may not yourself understand exactly why it's happening at first. But once you start to understand it, you start to deconstruct it. And you'll start to stabilize your field. You'll find yourself less and less down here. Thank you for the question.
This question is kind of personal, so you don't need to answer it if you don't want to. And if I'm out of line for asking it, please let me know.
Are you
but
going to ask about, what are you going to ask about?
the personal pocket of shame from which you hatched.
Oh, well, which one?
The first one that comes to mind.
The first one that comes to mind, I would say that I've had a pocket of shame around my sexual self-worth. That was something I had to really work through. I mean, I got into coaching because I sucked with women at first, because I had a lot of shame around whether or not women would even want to be with me. And so there was this sort of like, validate me, like I need to be cared about. Like women don't care about me. They would never care about me. And so I fought with that pocket for a long period of time. And I'm not going to get into where that came from. But yeah, that was the big pocket of shame, I would say. That, but you know, there's another good point with this, which is that this stuff is alchemy. So when you deal with stuff down here, you actually, like, it does allow you to springboard up further because you understand yourself more. Like, I wouldn't, when I was in my early 20s, there was just, I mean, especially teens, I was so much more down here. Like, I'd have panic attacks and all sorts of stuff. Like, dealing with all that stuff, it launched me further and further up.
So yeah, so you mentioned pornography addiction, and we're seeing now in society just it's becoming more mainstream with like movies and things like that. Could you discuss maybe some techniques that you could recommend men in general to like work on that aspect of shame, and because I mean it can lead to just very like being at the very like you were saying at very low conscious levels.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to mention is that the reason there's so much of this stuff in society today is because there's an orchestrated campaign to bring people down to this level. It's very important to understand that modern culture is designed to lower your consciousness, because people who are in lower consciousness are easier to control. Anybody up here, you can't control them. You build walls around them, you say, you can't do this. You know, you have to wear 3 masks in your car. And they're like, go fuck yourself. But this person, they're still wearing them. So I just want people to know, because there's a lot of judgment in the manosphere about like the state of modern men, and I totally get it. I mean, because the state of modern men is, you know, pussification. But there's this comparison like, well, you know, 100 years ago, like men were willing to go get blown up and, you know, they were brave, and now guys are pussies. Nobody's ever sustained this kind of psychological warfare against them, ever. If you're a man in this room and you're dealing with this stuff, like, you really got to give yourself credit, because it is an enormous spiritual, psychological war. Just because it hasn't gotten kinetic yet, don't think that you haven't, that you don't deserve some level of recognition for working through this stuff. It's really profound how awful it is. So things that you can do, well, I think when it comes to porn in particular, the most important thing to understand about it is it's not really about the woman. It's not really about getting laid or anything like that. It's about anxiety release. So there's a lot of tension, and then it's a way to try to, like, how do I get out that tension out of my body? So it usually comes from a guy who doesn't know how to properly relax or deal with anxiety. And one of the reasons that I think porn is really insidious is that on a psychological level, when you're like 12 years old, sometimes kids even these days are seeing it younger, it's kind of like sexual abuse if you see it at that age, it creates imprints, and so it creates shame imprints. Like one of the things, if a guy has ever ended up with a woman who had been like sexually abused when she was younger, you're gonna see that she's either like completely shut down sexually, or she's like hypersexual. Because she's constantly acting out this loop down here. And porn does a similar, it's obviously less than physical abuse, but it's a similar thing. So I think one of the big things is to understand what the impulse actually is. It's an anxiety release impulse. Like hypersexual women are not horny. They have anxiety, and that's how they're dealing with the anxiety. So thanks for the question.
Hello.
Hi.
That was a beautiful talk. Thank you very much. A lot of questions, but I'll have to distill them into two. One of them is, if I'm staying in the realms of peace and joy, but sometimes to function in society, I do have to dive down into anger for being effective. What is your viewpoint on that? Because obviously it's a lower state of consciousness, and I know it's kind of like an esoteric question. And the second one is...
Hold on, save the second one.
Okay.
Because this is a really good question. And it actually brings up something I forgot to mention in the speech. So there are some people who are like, I don't want to pay attention to what's going on in the world. I just want to go to the Sierra Nevada mountains and meditate all day long. It's like, fine, if you want to do that, you can do that. They want to stay up here. But what they're really doing is they're bypassing reality. Integration is not about just being here. It's about dealing with everything down here. And so, I'm Manosphere, don't get me wrong, but I find a lot of the sort of spirituality communities interesting because it's a very feminine space, but you can learn some interesting things from it. And there's a lot of women over there, and men too, not a lot of men in general there, but that are trying to ignore all this stuff. And the reality is that they're fine up here until somebody, okay, she's all love and light, and then her boyfriend goes for some other girl. And then she's trying to keep it in, it's okay, conscious non-monogamy. It's this, you can feel all the anxiety and everything that's still down here. She hasn't dealt with it. She's trying to ignore it. It's an avoidance. So to really get to a point of, say, spiritual life mastery, you have to integrate all this stuff. And so you're able to tap into these emotions. It's not a bad thing to experience these emotions. You can be up here, but then somebody is trying to force you to do something. You have to be firm in your boundaries, right? You can't, at that moment, it's not maybe constructive for you to be just trying to oh yeah, we're all together and everything. You have to be firm, and you have to say, no, you might have to drop down here a bit. You have to do it. A lot of navigating what we would call 3D reality right now. I mean, people who don't understand what's going on in the world, who don't want to understand what's going on in the world, are not doing themselves any favor. So, next
Thank
question.
you. That was a lovely answer. The second question is very relevant to what you just talked about. So you mentioned that there's a certain segment of population in the lower quadrant there. What is the energetic cost of somebody who is in a higher state of consciousness to interact with somebody like that? And why would you even do that?
Right. Good question. So if you want to get a little bit esoteric here, Dr. Hawking said, he's passed away now, but he said that the overall consciousness of society was beneath the level of integrity up until, I think, at some point in the 80s. And it's jumped up since then. And actually, it's continuing to go up. You might be surprised to know that consciousness of society is going up, because it doesn't certainly seem like it, but because what's going on right now is a lot of alchemy. A lot of this stuff is being dredged up. That's been suppressed. There is maybe you've heard the term the Great Awakening. I mean, there's a lot of people who are waking up to what's going on. They're waking up to the nature of reality. And so they're moving up here more and more and more, and they're becoming harder to control. Remember that the people up here emanate a lot more energy than the people down here. So even though there's more of these people, and there's less and less of them, up here, these people can do so much more. The American Revolution, I think it was like 3% of the population were responsible for the American Revolution. 3%, but they were up here. And so their impact was way more profound than all the people down here. I mean, this is really like sheep land, people who stay down here. They just go where the wind blows, essentially. So why would you interact with someone down here? Well, in certain contexts, you won't want to. I mean, I'll tell you something that's really, really difficult for people and is one of the reasons for the massive increase in entrepreneurship is because people are tired of working in 3D corporations, low consciousness corporate structures where you are, you're there to do what you're told. And there's not a lot of respect for agency and creativity. So if you're somebody up here and you have to work under a boss who's at Pride, you are going to be really miserable because they're going to be constantly trying to keep you down. So you wouldn't want to be in that situation. You would want to get out of it. And that's what a lot of people have been doing. That's why the structure is collapsing, because people are just saying, we're tired of these control structures. I don't want to be in this anymore. So there is some degree of having to interact with it day to day. You may have some family members. Be polite as you can. But there is also something to be said about, like, do you want to form close relationships with people who are down here? If you're up here, you absolutely do not. It's a parasitic dynamic. So, you can try to bring people up, but getting really close to people who are in this whole area, I mean, I give credit to it. Like, I do a good job coaching, but I work with people who are like here and up. Like, I work with people who are jumping out of here, and they have a lot of pockets down here, but they've finally hit the level of integrity, because working with people down here is so draining. And if you've ever dated a woman who's like a therapist or a social worker, or like maybe even a nurse, I mean, they're constantly dealing with these negative emotions, and they often are really miserable to be with because they've taken on all this negative emotion themselves. So yeah, I would keep some degree of a distance, but it's not completely avoidable. All right, thanks so much, guys.